Work hard and you can achieve whatever you want in life, right? That's what we're told. We're told that successful people are people that took control of their own fate, worked hard, didn't give up, and despite all odds became successful. And you know, it's a great story. It's inspiring. It gets your blood moving. However, it's simply not true. You see, the problem with that story is not that it's wrong, but that it's incomplete. It doesn't show the full picture that led a successful person to their success. And although hard work and perseverance are a huge piece in what it means to be successful, there's one piece that we often overlook, that we don't like to talk about when it comes to success, and that's luck. Luck plays a much bigger role in achieving success than we think it does. And everyone that's become successful became lucky at some point along their journey to success. And so the true formula to success in life, said by my favorite YouTuber, Ali Abdaal, is that success is hard work times luck times unfair advantages. In order for you to become successful in your own life, you need to see the full picture of how a successful person became successful and the big role that luck played in getting them there. And so in this video, I'm going to tell you 3 stories of successful people, the luck they encountered, the unfair advantage it created, and how they leveraged it to become successful. And this video is largely based on an amazing book called Outliers, The Story of Success by Malcolm Gladwell. I believe that anybody can become successful, but to become successful, you have to ditch this oversimplified roadmap that success is just hard work and perseverance, and see the full story that led someone to their success. So this first story that I want to tell you is about a group that we all know. It's about the Beatles and the luck of extreme practice. Unless you've been living under a rock your entire life, you've heard of the band The Beatles. Probably the most famous rock band of all time. They were the first big English band to come to the United States in 1964 in their so-called British invasion of the American music scene. A very successful band. Now, before the Beatles came to America in 1964, 7 years earlier, John Lennon and Paul McCartney started playing together. And they were just a normal struggling band in England until something happened. They came into some luck because in 1960, they were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. And this was a huge component that led to their success. You see, getting gigs isn't an easy thing to do. But in Hamburg, they played at strip clubs and went 5 times from 1960 to 1962. And in that 2-year period, they performed 270 nights, playing hours on end. And by the time they reached their big break in 1964, they had already played 1,200 live shows, which is insane because most bands today don't play 1,200 shows their entire career. And that lucky opportunity to go to Hamburg, Germany is what led them to become successful, because in those previous 1,200 shows, they learned stamina, discipline, and gave them an extreme level of practice. They got so much experience in those 2 years in Hamburg that when they got back to England, they were incredibly good because they had more experience than anybody. And so when we look at the story of the Beatles' success, they got the lucky opportunity to go to Hamburg, Germany, which gave them the unfair advantage of extreme practice to get better, ultimately leading them to the British invasion in 1964. Were the Beatles talented? Yes. Did the Beatles work extremely hard? There is no doubt about it. But were the Beatles extremely lucky to get the opportunity to go to Hamburg, Germany, to play more shows in 2 years than most musicians do their entire career? Absolutely. That's an opportunity that not everyone had. They were just at the right place at the right time. But when that opportunity came into their lives, they seized it, ultimately becoming the most famous band in history. Without Hamburg, there might have been no Beatles. So let's look at another story, and just like the Beatles, it's someone that you have heard of, and it's a story of Bill Gates and the luck of exposure and timing. Again, unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard of Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft and one of the richest people on earth. And you've probably heard his story. A kid drops out of Harvard, starts a company called Microsoft, and becomes a giant in the software world. But just like we learned in the Beatles story, success is not that simple. You see, Bill Gates was born into a very wealthy family, and because public school wasn't challenging enough for him, in 1968, he enrolled in a private school called Lakeside High School. And Lakeside had a computer club. And in the 60s, this was extremely uncommon. You see, even most colleges didn't have computer clubs because back then, computers were extremely big and extremely expensive. And Bill Gates got so much experience in that computer club. Then, because the school he went to was composed of elite families, in 1971, the computer club was invited to the University of Washington to use their advanced computers. And in a 7-month period, their computer club ran up 1,575 hours of computer time, working 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. Bill Gates was obsessed with computers. Now next, because he had so much experience, more experience than anybody, working on these extremely expensive, rare computers, in 1973, his senior year of high school, he got an opportunity to spend his spring semester at Bonneville Power Station to work on their advanced computers. And from 8th to 12th grade, he got more experience working on these expensive computers than anybody at that time because his elite connections allowed him to get the exposure. But the story gets more interesting because in 1975, the first affordable personal computer was released for $397. And the thing that is so interesting and important is that if you're a 30-year-old in 1975, you might have kids, a mortgage, and a career, so buying a $400 computer isn't a priority. Whereas if you're a 20-year-old in 1975, normally you don't have these responsibilities and obligations, so you could save up to get the computer. And you know how old Bill Gates was in 1975? You got it. 20 years old. And so he bought the computer, dropped out of Harvard, and started Microsoft. And just to emphasize how important this date of 1975 is, you know who else was 20 years old in 1975? Steve Jobs, as well as many other giants in the software world. And so when we look at the story of Bill Gates' success, he was lucky to be born in a rich family and go to Lakeside High School, which gave him the unfair advantage of getting 7 years of programming experience, ultimately leading him to creating Microsoft. Was Bill Gates smart? Yes. Did Bill Gates work extremely hard? There is no doubt about it. But was Bill Gates lucky to have 9 years of programming experience by the time the first affordable computer came out? I think it's fair to say absolutely. And just like the Beatles, he got an opportunity and he took advantage of that, ultimately leading him to creating Microsoft. Without Lakeside, there might not be Microsoft. And so let me tell you one final story. But unlike these other two stories, this story is a little different. And it's a story of the Jewish immigrant and the luck of disadvantage. So the stories of the Beatles and Bill Gates are stories of immense privilege. However, you don't need to come from privilege in order to be successful. Sometimes your disadvantages can be your biggest strength. And to prove that, let's look at a man named Joe Flum, who was one of the top New York City lawyers of his time. Now, very quickly, this is his story. Joe grew up during the Great Depression to poor Jewish immigrant parents. However, despite that, because of hard work, he got into an elite public high school, joined the army, and after went to Harvard to get his law degree. Worked in corporate law takeovers for 20 years, eventually becoming a top New York City lawyer. Now, as we've seen in this video, there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes when someone becomes successful. And unlike Bill Gates and the Beatles, Joe became successful because he had so many disadvantages in his life. And there were 3 disadvantages that helped him become successful. The first disadvantage was being born during the Great Depression. You see, the Great Depression was a very tough time to be alive, and because it was so tough, people didn't have as many kids, which meant smaller class sizes and more individual attention. Because there weren't as many jobs, teachers were highly skilled. Less people going to university meant lower tuition, and if you got the education, there was less job competition. Which explains this part of the story. The second disadvantage was being born to poor immigrant parents. His parents were poor garment workers, and he worked in that industry as well. However, in that industry, he learned how to work independently, the importance of learning every aspect of a business, and how when you work more, you make more. He learned those skills because he had to, and it made him an extremely hard worker. The third disadvantage was being Jewish. You see, despite having a degree in law, Joe had trouble finding work because he was Jewish, and at that time, there was a lot of discrimination towards the Jews. So he had to do the work that the non-Jewish people didn't want to do, which was corporate law takeovers. It was the only work that he could find, and he worked in that industry for 20 years. But 20 years later, that field became the most desired field in law, and because he had the most experience in corporate takeovers, everyone came to him, and he became the top New York City lawyer. His disadvantages in life became his biggest strengths. And so if we look at the story of Joe Flum, he was lucky to have the disadvantages that gave him the unfair advantage of having 20 years of experience in an undesired field that eventually made him a top New York City lawyer. He was lucky, but in a different way. He had so many disadvantages, but turned those disadvantages into his biggest strengths. And so I want to finish this video with one final thought, and that's the complicated story of success. As I said in the beginning of this video, we often have an oversimplified idea of how people become successful in life. That successful people are people that take control of their own fate, work hard, don't give up, and despite all odds, become successful. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's missing a huge component of how people become successful, and that's luck. And so I want to leave you with this. People become successful not just because of hard work and perseverance, but if we've learned anything in this video, is that there's a lot of luck that goes into someone's success. The Beatles had Hamburg, Bill Gates had Lakeside, and Joe Flum had disadvantages. And these things that happened to them weren't things that were necessarily in their control. They just ran into some luck. But the truth is, we all come into some luck at some point in our lives. But what makes someone successful or not successful is whether or not they choose to seize the opportunity. The Beatles could have stayed in England. Bill Gates could have spent his high school years partying. Joe Flum could have lived his life as a victim, but they didn't. Each and every one of them saw the opportunity, seized it, and that is what made them successful. And so what I'm trying to say in this video is that whenever luck comes in your life, seize the opportunity, because luck doesn't come around that often. And with that, muchas gracias, que tenga un buen día, nos vemos, chicos.